The dust has settled after the NFL draft, so we're breaking down a big-time wide receiver rankings tier list update. We're going to go in kind of 3 segments for this video. We've never done it like this, so let us know how you like it. We're going to start with our cornerstone wide receivers, so wide receivers age 25 and younger. Then we're going to go over kind of like our veteran wide receivers age 26 and older. And then we'll kind of do like an amalgamation of our top 36 wide receivers tier list at the end of it. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. If you get some value from it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. All of our rankings, positional, trade value charts, all that stuff is available on flockfantasy.com. Use the promo code FSE, hit the link down below in the description to check that out. But before we get into it, let's hit the intro. All right, so if you skip the intro, what we're doing in the first segment of this video is going over our cornerstone dynasty wide receiver rankings, which are wide receivers who are age 25 and younger. So players that you can build a dynasty roster around, guys that you don't mind holding through the duration of a rebuild. These are the wide receivers that are worth their weight in gold in dynasty superflex leagues. We love hoarding as many of these guys as we possibly can. And of course, it starts at the top with CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. I don't really have to argue any of these players' abilities. We all know that like all 3 of these guys have had top 5 fantasy point per game seasons, and they also are tethered to pretty good offenses. Lamb obviously had the best of the 3 seasons last year. Chase, of course, his rookie and sophomore year when he was on the field was very good. And then Justin Jefferson, probably pound for pound the best wide receiver in the league. A little bit of a downgrade right now because he's going through a transitional period at quarterback. But regardless, these guys we have listed kind of 3 first rounders is the equivalent value if you want to acquire these guys on a trade.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, everybody who plays fantasy football in general knows from an age perspective that these are the 3 young superstar wide receivers in the league. I think you can make the case too, of course, from a pure redraft standpoint that a guy like Tyreek Hill would also be in this area, but given the age complex, we're going to talk about him a little bit later on in these dynasty rankings video. But for the most part, these guys are so ironclad from a projection standpoint. CeeDee Lamb currently the 2nd ranked player over on Underdog in terms of ADP. Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson also being ranked inside of the top 5. They're the cream of the crop, man. Like they're the guys that you're expecting to go out there, have 1,500 plus yards, 10 plus touchdowns, be 20 plus PPR point per game receivers. And given their age, all being 25 or under, it's just one of the safest bets in Dynasty having one of these guys on your roster.
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm a contender, I absolutely want one of these anchors anchoring out my wide receiver 1 spot. So next tier of guys, we have, I would honestly argue, maybe a mini tier within this tier of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Both of these guys obviously bring something a little bit different to the table. With Marvin, you're getting the potential next dynasty wide receiver 1 overall because he's only 21 years old coming into the league with the Arizona Cardinals. We know that this was a pretty good landing spot for him. Kyler Murray has fed his number 1 receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, in years past. Marvin Harrison, the generational prospect that we all thought he was, gets top 5 draft capital. One of the safer projections in terms of a dynasty rookie wide receiver that I've ever seen. And I mean, Underdog Fantasy, he's already going as a top 15 to 20 player in redraft.
Higher. He's currently the 13th overall ranked player in terms of ADP, ranked as the wide receiver 9 in terms of ADP. The sharpest drafters, the ones that have skin in the game right now, are drafting Marvin Harrison Jr. as a 1-2 turn pick. Despite being a rookie wide receiver, he does have that top 5 capital, and he's entering a situation where we can't really expect rookie wide receivers prior to the last few years being dominant from day one. But we've seen now with Jamar Chase coming in, with Justin Jefferson coming in, Puka Nacua last year, that rookies can make an impact early on. And with Marvin Harrison Jr. being the best prospect of the bunch, having Kyler Murray at quarterback, having no real target competition outside of Trey McBride on that offense at this current point, he's a safe bet even as a rookie. And if we're making that type of argument for him from a redraft perspective, it's easy to see why he's the consensus wide receiver 4 in Dynasty. And to be honest, kind of feels like we're hedging our bet here, having him a mini tier behind Lamb, Chase, and Jefferson, because when it's all said and done, we could project back next year in startups and talk about how he's the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in Dynasty after a 1,200-yard, 10-touchdown rookie season, given the fact that he's 3 years younger than those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And with St. Brown, he's just a little bit behind those top guys in the first tier as well, but he's equally as productive. You could make the argument in redraft that he should be ranked over some of these guys, given the quarterback situation that Jefferson has, the fact that Amon-Ra is basically a lock for 170 targets next year, got a big-time contract extension as well, so we know he's tethered to that offense, that Detroit Lions scheme for the long term. So St. Brown, wide receiver 5 for us in these cornerstone rankings. This next group of guys all kind of bring something different to the table. You have Garrett Wilson, who are kind of projecting a big third-year breakout with Aaron Rodgers now healthy. The offensive line got some upgrades, but he's still the number one dude there. Malik Neighbors, the stud prospect that he was, just a touch behind Marvin Harrison Jr. as a prospect. Again, from a dynasty perspective, we have him up here because we believed in the prospect, even though the situation with Daniel Jones and the Giants is not quite as good as, say, the Chargers had he gone there. I believe he absolutely is deserving of going this high. And then you have Puka Nacua, who obviously just had the best rookie season yardage-wise of any rookie wide receiver we've seen last year. So I believe you actually have Nacua higher than Neighbors, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So with each one of these guys, again, they're cornerstone wide receivers. They're guys that you build your dynasty roster around. It's kind of like if you're trying to build a cornerstone wide receiver group around a team that's a little bit more competitive, Wilson and Nacua are probably your guys. If you're okay waiting half a season, a full season to really achieve that value that Malik Neighbors can bring to the table, he also, just like Marvin, has the ability to eventually be dynasty wide receiver 1 someday. He is a guy that you might have to wait a little bit longer on, though. His underdog ADP is more in that like second, third round area.
Yeah, the risk with a guy like Malik Neighbors versus Marvin, why, although some people may view these guys from a talent perspective being on par, I mean, heck, even the FSC prospect model itself has these guys as the 2 best prospects we've seen at wide receiver in the last 10 years. The difference is that the downside could be we see Garrett Wilson a pick ahead of him. Garrett Wilson, we're projecting the quarterback upgrade with Aaron Rodgers. Garrett Wilson last year, 168 targets despite bad quarterback play. But yeah, and the downside risk with Malik Neighbors is kind of what we saw with Garrett Wilson these first couple of years, where despite commanding a large amount of targets, despite being productive in his first 2 years, doesn't really have that ceiling of a Marvin Harrison, Monter St. Brown, top 3 wide receivers based off the quarterback play, because Garrett Wilson, despite commanding 168 targets last year, with Aaron Rodgers going out, Zach Wilson throwing them the ball, obviously bad quarterback play, it didn't actually equalize into fantasy points. With Garrett Wilson, now we're projecting forward, Aaron Rodgers back, potential top 10 quarterback play. With Malik Neighbors, a little bit more of a question mark if Daniel Jones doesn't get back to 2022 levels.
Yeah, and with all of these wide receivers in this tier outside of Malik Neighbors, like from a redraft perspective, early projectable value for these guys, I have St. Brown, my wide receiver 5 for best ball. I have Puka Nacua, my wide receiver 7 for best ball. I have Garrett Wilson, my wide receiver 8 for best ball. I have Marvin Harrison, my wide receiver 10 for best ball. So these guys are all top 10 redraft wide receivers, in addition to being young studs that can still hold and accumulate value on the dynasty market. Whereas Malik Neighbors, I have towards the back end of my top 18, top 20 area, where we have a little bit more question marks about his immediate short-term value, given the fact that he's playing with Daniel Jones coming off of an ACL tear. But I do believe, like with Garrett Wilson, like you said, we're going to see the ability. We're going to see the target earning ability. And it's going to be an easy floor projection early on in his career. He'll probably never dip below wide receiver 10 in Dynasty. It's just that he might not get to wide receiver 1, 2, or 3 in Dynasty for 2-3 years until he gets a quarterback upgrade.
Yeah, and again, this is not denying the talent at all. It's just understanding the perspective here that if I have Lamb, Chase, Jefferson in the top 4, Amon-Ra, Puka, Garrett Wilson in the top 7, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. as my wide receiver 9, he does have to be after those guys, considering the fact that he is as my wide receiver 16 in best ball at this current point.
Yeah, exactly. So the next tier that we have here, and this is where kind of things get a little funky because me and you have obviously differing rankings consensus-wise. I have certain players higher than you. You have certain players higher than me. But basically on a consensus basis, guys that we value as about a mid-first rounder and a mid-second rounder, give or take on the open market. Drake London, Rome Odunze, Chris Olave, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, and Nico Collins. Each guy kind of brings something different to the table. With both London and Olave, you're talking about bona fide number 1 wide receivers. Both guys hopefully have their breakout season coming as third-year players, where London especially gets a major quarterback upgrade with Kirk Cousins. Olave still going very high in terms of like underdog drafts and redraft ADP, so he's a guy that we can bank on 30% of his team's targets. Rome Odunze, the young guy of this group, hasn't proven anything in the NFL, but he was, again, if Malik Neighbors was a touch below Marvin as an elite prospect, Rome Odunze was a touch below both of those guys as a very, very good prospect, the top 6 prospect we've seen since 2016, according to the FSC prospect model, and he's tethered to Caleb Williams. So unlike those guys, he has absolutely no question for quarterback play, in my opinion, because I believe Caleb will come in right away, really, and be a dominant quarterback from jump, but he has more target competition than those guys, DJ Moore, Keenan Allen there in the short term. So that's kind of the difference between those guys. And then with Waddle, Smith, and Collins, Waddle and Smith, we know they're number 2 receivers, at least in the short term, but they are young still. They have more long-term viability than the guys ahead of them, Tyreek Hill and AJ Brown, and they're in good offenses that we really trust to put up points. And then Nico Collins is the guy that's kind of the newcomer to this area, where he had a monster season last year, but it is only the only time he's done that. And CJ Stroud really elevated the play of him. And Stephon Diggs comes in, and they still have Tank Dell, who was injured for some of the year. So Nico Collins is probably the riskiest guy of this group, but he definitely belongs, I think, in this tier from a conversation standpoint, because he has a really, really high redraft ceiling as well.
Yeah. So for reference, out of this entire tier, we do have Nico Collins technically listed at the back end, but from a pure best ball rankings perspective, he's a guy I would rank 1 out of this group. So my current best ball rankings, as I currently have it, correction, Drake London 1 spot higher. Drake London would be my wide receiver 11. But the way I kind of view this tier from a dynasty perspective, in my opinion, we kind of talked about it a little bit off camera, is given the youth, given the value appreciation, I kind of view it Drake London, Rome Odunze, Olave as a mini tier, and then the veteran producing wide receivers, Waddle, Devontae Smith, and Nico Collins in that next tier. Like you said with Nico, he's a guy that out of that Waddle, Smith, Collins tier, this is going to be subjective depending on who you project for to be the best player in terms of best ball. Me personally, Nico Collins would be the guy I project the most, having him as a top 15 wide receiver. Waddle right on the cusp of that as well. Devontae Smith as a top 20 option as well for me. The reason why I kind of view London, Odunze, and Olave in a higher regard is that I do feel like there's a path for them to be entering that next Puka, Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra tier that I just don't feel like at this point, given the market complex, given the age, that Waddle, Smith, and Collins can kind of reach.
Yeah, and I mean, with Odunze, you're getting a 22-year-old. Olave's 24. London's 23.
Yeah.
Like, you're getting a little bit younger players. Than Waddle's going to be 26 this year. Devontae Smith is going to be 25, I believe, this year.
26.
And then Nico Collins is 25 right now. So, I mean, with those guys, you're talking about a little bit older. So from a dynasty perspective, 24-year-old wide receiver versus 25-year-old receiver, not that big. But the value does start to deflate a little bit on the open market once someone sees that Devontae Smith, let's say a year and a half from now, is going to be 27 versus a year and a half from now, Drake London will be 24 and a half, right? Like, there is a bit of a difference in terms of people's minds when they're selecting the draft button on these players, when they're looking to trade for these players on the open market. So that small age discrepancy is kind of what puts those guys ahead for me. But from a redraft standpoint, I mean, London's my wide receiver 11 in best ball right now.
Yeah.
Waddle at 14, Olave at 15, Nico Collins at 17, Devontae Smith at 20. They're all kind of in the same relative range. And then Odunze is a little bit lower because of the short-term projection, but he's obviously the youngest and has the most accumulation potential here.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Where do you currently have Odunze in your best ball rankings?
I have Odunze at 28 in my best ball rankings, and he's kind of in a group of you can't even really compare him to a guy like Amari Cooper, because Amari Cooper, from a best ball and a redraft standpoint, we kind of know what his projection is, whereas Odunze is more of like the upside swing that if you already have a lot of good projections on your team, you would take. And same goes from like a dynasty perspective too. Like when you're drafting Odunze in like the 4th round of a dynasty draft, you probably have a couple guys already that you feel pretty good about, and you can use him as a value accumulator to potentially become a top 8-10 dynasty wide receiver after this year.
No, I agree with you. I have him similar spot in best ball, and the allure of a guy like Rome Odunze is you can argue from a ceiling perspective, from a talent perspective, that he could very well, like I mentioned with a guy like Olave and London, be viewed in that second tier this time next year. The only concern there, the only downside is, can he overcome his situation of the target competition? Obviously with Caleb, obviously potentially being the number 1 receiver from a talent perspective on his team. I think you can make the case with him and DJ Moore from a talent perspective, but I do think the ceiling for Rome Odunze is the best talent, is the number 1 target on this team. The question though is that if it ends up being a JSN situation, does the market agree with that?
Yeah, because I think that Keenan Allen is good enough still that he's going to be enough of a pest that he could factor into Odunze's early season target share. And also, I mean, from best ball perspective, you're playing for late in the season, which is why we have Odunze ranked rather aggressively. Yeah. But Dynasty too, I mean, things change pretty quickly during the season, and there's definitely going to be buying windows on a guy like Odunze. If, say, week 6, he's not even playing a full allotment of snaps yet. He's not even a guy that's commanding, more than 18% of his team's targets, just like there was with guys like JSN last year, guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown his rookie season, guys where they get out to a slow start, but they start to pick it up down the stretch of the season. Rashee Rice was a guy like that last year. Rome Odunze strikes me as a guy that maybe you don't need to rank him this aggressively yet. You can maybe wait a little bit before you start to get aggressive with him, because there is a chance that people sour on him early in the season, and that makes for a buying window, say in week 5, week 6.
Regardless, though, he's still the type of talent. He's still in the insulated spot from a long-term perspective. If you are drafting a young team in your startup, where I'd be comfortable taking him at the tail end of the third, but I do think in most leagues, he may even fall closer to the mid to late fourth, depending on how they value rookies.
Yeah, for sure. So this next tier of guys here, again, you can make an argument that there's not even a tier drop off at all from some of the guys we talked about at the beginning of the last year, where like Waddle, Smith, Nico Collins, guys like that, where we have T. Higgins, Zay Flowers, Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, Tank Dell, Brian Thomas Jr., and Ladd McConkey. Again, there's a huge amalgamation of names here where some of these guys are rookies. Xavier Worthy obviously goes to the Chiefs. Great landing spot for him. He was a great prospect. I had him wide receiver 4 pre-draft. He goes to the Chiefs. He's still my wide receiver 4 among rookies. Brian Thomas Jr., high upside player, goes to a situation where he's not required to be the number 1 target earner from day one. Christian Kirk is there. He can command targets in the short to intermediate area. And then Brian Thomas can work downfield. And then Ladd McConkey goes to, again, another ideal landing spot for him, where he can just be the PPR stud for Justin Herbert, move the chains of this offense. And then you also have to work in the other rookies from last year. Zay Flowers had a great rookie season. Jordan Addison had a great rookie season, 900 yards, 10 touchdowns. Tank Dell, before he got injured, was like a 16-point-per-game producer. So you have to factor in these guys. And then randomly, you got T. Higgins waving there, where he's the veteran of this group who's going to be a wide receiver 2 projection, similar to Smith and Waddle, as the number 2 on his team, in an offense that I think all of us kind of expect to bounce back because Burrow was hurt most of the year last year.
And it's funny because of how long T. Higgins been in the league. Like, you would assume that he would be like where Michael Pittman and stuff are in the veterans area, but it kind of just goes to show you. I mean, I guess like Higgins, Lamb, Jefferson were all in the same draft class, but kind of goes to show you that like these guys are going to graduate soon, and it's up to those youngins to eventually take their spots. But yeah, with T. Higgins, it's kind of like 90% of the redraft projection that we have for Nico, Smith, and Waddle, hence why he's the tier below them. And like you said, with the young guys, you have Worthy as your wide receiver 4. He's currently my 6, but I do feel like all 3 of those wide receivers between Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey, and Xavier Worthy, the reason why they're in the mid to late first rounder tier is that they're like the 109 to 111 in this draft class specifically, which you can make the case for in normal draft classes would be the 106 to 108. So I do feel like the value appropriation there, mid to late first rounder. If we're talking about in 2025, I think you can make the case that they're mid first rounders.
Yeah, absolutely. And just similar to your point about T. Higgins, we think, oh, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, these guys are so young. It's like Higgins is younger than both of them, actually.
Yeah.
Even though he was drafted in 2020, he's 2 months younger than both of those players. So Waddle and Smith might seem like they're younger because they were drafted a year later, but Higgins is actually younger than both of them. And he's actually proven basically as high end, if not higher end production than both of those guys. All of those guys have a back end wide receiver 1 finish in points per game. So they're all, in my opinion, to be treated the exact same. And on the open market, I think I have Higgins ranked rather aggressively compared to where he's actually going in startups right now. Waddle and Smith are going like a solid round and a half ahead of Dynasty startup ADP right now. And Higgins remains, honestly, one of the better buy lows for contending teams, in my opinion.
Agreed. Yeah, like if you can tell me right now you have Smith, Waddle, Collins, and you're able to net Higgins plus a 2 for one of those guys, I'm making that down tier every single time because I view their range of outcomes relatively similar. It's just the main difference, of course, is that Nico Collins I have ranked rather aggressively in redraft because I just view the ceiling as being up there, especially in a best ball format. But specifically, these guys are like wide receiver 2s. Higgins more of a low end wide receiver 2. If you can capitalize on that market inefficiency, get that second round pick, especially people are kind of viewing the 2025 class right now as being inferior to 2024, which I fully get it. It absolutely is. But as we know, as we get closer to that 2025 class, that 2025 2 is going to keep increasing in value.
Yeah, exactly. And Collins, I didn't even mention him. People might think he's really young because he just broke out this year. He's a month younger than Higgins. So like, even though he was drafted a year later, these guys were all drafted in 1999. Like they're all basically the same age, or all drafted in 1999. They're all born in 1999. And I believe Waddle actually born in 1998, if I'm not mistaken. So we do have the next tier of guys here in this cornerstone, closing it out. Basically, we have like our top 25 or so cornerstone rankings of wide receivers here. And then, like I said, we'll pivot into the veterans if you guys are looking for more like how do we rank these guys amongst each other if we're solely looking for production in a startup. George Pickens, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jaden Reed, Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette, Rashee Rice. I mean, there's a couple guys here that you could also maybe like honorable mention to. I'm trying to think off the top of my head here. We have Adonai Mitchell and Ricky Pearsall and Jalen Polk and guys like that who
Yeah.
just missed the cut on here. But I would say
Christian
all of these guys
Watson.
kind of have their merits as well. Like George Pickens, I could definitely make the argument you should have him higher. Like we should both have him higher than this. But I feel a little bit wary about the Steelers quarterback situation, which is why he's kind of a little bit lower for me. And then JSN, I feel like if anybody in this tier has the potential to climb the most in these rankings, because if you told me JSN went out and had like an 1,100 yard, 7 touchdown season this year, like he might be all the way up where like Olave and London are because of what we thought about him before the NFL draft last year. He was consensus wide receiver 1 for most people.
And I think you can make that case as well for really Jaden Reed, Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette, where if they had big time, I mean, George Pickens, honest to God, all of these guys kind of fit that moniker because obviously when we're talking about the young guys, you could make the case that they are slightly more volatile than the tier above them, but the upside remains the same. And that's kind of why it's a wide receiver cluster at this point, where once you pass, in my opinion, I think Olave is like the final guy. Once you get past Olave, it really feels like you can make the case for any of these guys being in any order this time next year.
Yeah, and it's weird because we don't usually talk about like using redraft for Dynasty, which we're kind of doing in this video with like where we have them ranked for best ball purposes and stuff. But like the reality is, like if Rashee Rice, let's say he doesn't get suspended, he's probably going to. But if he didn't get suspended and had a wide receiver 12 season in points per game next year, he'd be all the way at the top of this tier. And same goes for Jalen Waddle. If Jalen Waddle has like a 9.6 point per game season next year, he's going to be way down from where he is right now. So even though like all these guys are young, they're all hypothetically going to continue improving or at least maintain their production. There's going to be volatility year over year based on just who produced from a redraft perspective. If Keon Coleman goes out there, has a great rookie season, he's going to vault all the way up here. If Jaden Reed goes out there, has a sophomore slump after what he did his rookie year, he's going to fall down below this area. So it's really all going to depend kind of on the short-term projections of a lot of these guys, which is why I have Pickens a little bit lower because I don't really feel that great about his quarterback situation, about the offense that he's going to play in this year versus a guy like Jordan Addison or Tank Dell or Zay Flowers, who I feel a little bit better about their situations.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, I mean, the main person that sticks out about this tier and the biggest wild card of this tier is actually going to be Rashee Rice. Because, I mean, we were talking about a couple months ago of him being well within that London, Odunze, Olave, Waddle, Smith, Collins tier. Obviously, the legal concerns, we have to drop him. But at what point does he become a value? Because I've seen people say, oh, yeah, I wouldn't buy him for more than a 3rd round rookie pick. And it's like, well, at that point, there's no risk. Like if I have to give up a 3rd round rookie pick to potentially hit a guy that is going to be worth, if not multiple firsts, at least a 1 and 2, if he stays on the field with Rashee Rice, I'm taking that swing every single time. And I get it. The risks is there. The concerns are there. I'm not trying to diminish the character concerns with what we've seen this offseason, but at some points, man, you got to swing for home, man. Like you got to take risk in your dynasty draft. And depending on what the opportunity cost is, again, we have listed here late first, early second. I can bet you right now in the majority of your leagues, you're probably getting Rashee Rice for the 210 or later.
Yeah, I mean, it would really depend because I'm notoriously the guy that's like out on the
Risk
knuckleheads.
averse.
Like that's usually something that I just don't mess with. Like I was selling Jameson Williams like crazy last offseason after the gambling stuff or even slightly before it. This year, I sold my only share of Rashee Rice for the 204 and the 205, and then it was Rashee Rice in the 302. I sold that to Ian actually. So I essentially traded out Rashee Rice for Xavier Legette straight up and netted Michael Penix for like Blake Corum, I think, or Marshawn Lloyd, who went at 302. So for me, it was worth offloading that risk. And that was actually before the second issue came out. That was just after the car accident. It wasn't before the nightclub bullshit that Rashee Rice has been involved in lately. So again, I tend to lean when these guys show their character. I'm usually out. I'm not buying. But if it's a basement price tag, late second rounder in 2025, 3rd round picks or whatever, any other wide receiver that's in that vicinity, that's kind of the point where I would actually buy Rashee Rice. So for me, I have him like wide receiver 35 to 40 in Dynasty right now. But if I knew he was just going to get a 6-game suspension, he was, not going to make any more mistakes going forward, he would probably be in that top 20-ish range where Addison, Tank Dell, and the other guys from his draft class are ranked right now.
And I would argue he'd be above that tier. I think he'd be more so.
Well, Worthy got drafted also. And to me, Worthy
Fair.
was enough of a hit to his value that it also affected him in addition to the legal situation. Because it's not before, like the first time we did this video, I believe was back in like January, February area. 14. And Worthy hadn't been drafted there either. And Marquise Brown hadn't been signed either. So they have added players around him. And Kelsey also re-signed a 2-year deal as well. So it's not just that the legal stuff happened with Rashee Rice the last time we did our rankings in a video format. It's that he also had competition added.
Oh, 100%. I agree. The competition would get him more so in that mid wide receiver 2 tier, like barring the legal issues. But do have to give flowers, man. 938 yards, 7 touchdowns as a rookie, especially coming on down the stretch like he did, commanding the snaps. Because initially, I mean, we saw prior to the bye week, he wasn't getting over 70% of the snaps. As soon as he got that snap increase, he was a legitimate top 12 overall wide receiver in redraft. So it depends what the price is. I would say if you are a risk averse manager, I understand going away from Rashee Rice. But if you can get such a discount and knowing the upside is there to legitimately be a top 12 wide receiver down the stretch like he showed last year, I get it. Target competition does matter, but I love seeing young players command the targets the way Rashee Rice did. There's a price that it becomes palpable, and I do feel like late second, early third rounder this year is about that price.
Yeah, I would be willing to pay at mid two next year. I just
I
don't
would
think
too.
people are going to sell for that cheap. Like, I think people are going to just be like, you know what, at that point, I'm just going to hold him. They're going to recognize that getting that price tag to get out is not good enough. And to me, he strikes me more as like, subpar prospect comes in, has a great rookie season, flash in the pan because he's a bit of a knucklehead. That sounds a little bit like Chase Claypool to me, and that makes me a little nervous knowing how high we were on Chase Claypool a couple years ago. That's what makes me nervous about Rashee Rice, is because teams had him off their board. He had these incidents at SMU. He had this incident with the car accident. It's stacking up to the point that I think I know who this guy is at this point, and I'm kind of out on it.
The big difference between him and Claypool is that one would be catching passes from Patrick Mahomes, and the other one would be catching passes from the corpse of Big Ben.
Yeah, no, I agree. But they also have other receiving targets
Oh,
there:
100%.
Kelsey, Xavier Worthy, Marquise Brown. So again, a little bit concerned about the Rashee Rice situation. We haven't really talked about it, so it's good that we talked about it in this video.
For sure.
Let's transition away from the cornerstone wide receivers. Let's talk about some of the veteran wide receivers here. And you notice this list is a little bit more barren among guys that are kind of like in that top 40 wide receiver overall in Dynasty rankings for us, because we love young receivers. That's just how the Dynasty market works, really. Honestly, the second receivers get a little bit older, they start to lose a little bit of value, like we talked about. So the guys that make up like our top end veteran wide receivers, if you guys are going through basically a like win now build, or a build where you're going to try and be competitive early on in your startup, guys like AJ Brown, Brandon Ayuk, and Tyreek Hill make up kind of the top of that tier, where if you draft these guys, they're young enough. So like AJ Brown and Brandon Ayuk, a little bit young enough that you could maybe punt 1 year, but for the most part, you're going to want to compete sooner rather than later.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, these guys are all in that tier for a reason. They're all guys going within the top 12 wide receivers over on Underdog right now. Like, I believe if I check it out, AJ Brown's going as the wide receiver 7, Brandon Ayuk going as the wide receiver 11, and of course, Tyreek Hill going as the wide receiver 2 off the board. Tyreek Hill having the biggest longevity concerns here, being the oldest of this group, potential rumors of him retiring, whether after this year, after the next year. I believe you posted it, where after his current contract is done, he's talked about potentially retiring from football, which is going to be the concern there. Like, if he was the same age as AJ Brown and Brandon Ayuk, 26, 27, you'd be talking about him in that tier with Jefferson, with Chase, with Lamb. So I feel like you have to kind of hedge it there, have him in this area with AJ Brown and Brandon Ayuk. AJ Brown having a little bit more redraft appeal, Brandon Ayuk being a tad bit younger. So it's really a pick your flavor at that point.
Yeah, for sure. And then DJ Moore and Michael Pittman are just like shave off 2 or 3 points per game from their projection. And that's kind of what you get with Moore and Michael Pittman, where both of these guys are 27 and 26 and a half respectively. DJ Moore just turned 27, Michael Pittman 26 and a half. DJ Moore, I feel a little bit better about, even though he's a little bit older than Michael Pittman, because he has Caleb Williams now at quarterback. But Michael Pittman is the clear number one of his offense. And even though Adonai Mitchell has this high ceiling or whatever, I personally would envision that Michael Pittman remains the number one wide receiver unless AD Mitchell really hit the nuts with his ceiling. Then he could maybe alpha him. But for me, I actually think year one, it's a 50-50 toss-up that Rome Odunze is the best receiver on this team, to be honest. And long-term, I absolutely think he will become the best receiver on this team. So for me, DJ Moore is going to move down slightly, because had they just taken an offensive lineman at number 9 overall or whatever, he would be probably a lot higher than this, in terms of he'd be right in there with AJ Brown, Brandon Ayuk, and Tyreek Hill, because the projection would be so high with Caleb Williams coming in. It's just that Odunze is that good of a prospect that I think he eventually will potentially alpha DJ Moore at some point.
No, and I agree fully here. This is kind of like the veteran, steady wide receiver 1 producers with some concerns of potential talent on their team usurping them in terms of overall projectable ceiling. I feel more strongly, obviously, about Odunze than I do AD Mitchell, but it's undeniable that if AD Mitchell does reach a ceiling, I do feel like he has a projectable higher upside than what Michael Pittman is in that offense. But likewise, I think Roma Dunze has a higher upside than what DJ Moore's been in that offense. So kind of balancing it out. DJ Moore, better quarterback play, in my opinion, with Caleb versus Anthony Richardson. Also has more target share because not only does he have to compete with Roma Dunze, also has to compete there with Keenan Allen, at least in the short term. So I feel like this is kind of the safe mark where if you're a contending team, you want a wide receiver one to be a consistent producer in your lineup. Pittman and Moore kind of fit that profile.
Yeah, and ideally, if you build a contending team out of a startup, in our Flock Me Silly League, I took Jamar Chase and AJ Brown before drafting DJ Moore. So, like, ideally, in a contending roster, your team is good enough that you have DJ Moore as like your third best wide receiver in a full PPR league, and that's where you get that point production from. Whereas, like, if he's your number one wide receiver or whatever, you better have a lot of depth and a lot of high end talent at other positions to be able to make up for that. So, for me, DJ Moore, more so like the guy that if I'm contending, I want as my wide receiver 2, my wide receiver 3 on my roster, more so than my wide receiver 1. This next group of guys, again, they all kind of bring something different to the table. DK Metcalf, a little bit younger than some of these dudes, but Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, Mike Evans. I think when you talk about the redraft projection for these guys, I have Devontae Adams at wide receiver 12. I have Mike Evans at wide receiver 13. I have Deebo Samuel a little bit lower than market. I think Underdog has him just inside the top 20 or so, or top 24 or so. I actually have him at 25. And then I also have Metcalf at 26. So with Adams and Evans, they're older, but they're the better projections from a redraft perspective, right? With Devontae Adams, he's going to have 160 plus targets this year. They're just going to come from Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. And Mike Evans has Baker Mayfield as his quarterback, whereas Deebo Samuel is a part of a better offense than both of those guys. And DK Metcalf has JSN, who's kind of lurking in the shadows, and Tyler Lockett's still there as well. So it's kind of pick your poison. How do you project these guys out from like a redraft standpoint? Because with these veteran wide receivers, you do really need to think about the short-term projection you're looking at. And you could definitely make the argument, to be honest, that Adams and Evans belong ahead of these guys. I just like that Metcalf and Samuel are like 2 or 3 years younger than those guys.
Yeah, so it's funny, and I'll contextualize this especially too when we talk about the veterans in the next tier, a la Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, and Cooper Kupp specifically. But in terms of this tier, it's like you got the high upside veteran receivers in terms of a redraft perspective. Mike Evans, a guy I have ranked inside my top 14. Devontae Adams, I have a guy ranked inside my top 14 at 13 and 14, respectively, for those guys. DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel, a little bit more younger, a little bit more liquid assets, but they're more so a fringe top 25 level projection. So, like Corey said, when I'm deciding between this tier, I agree from a market value perspective that they should be selected within each other of startups at this current point. But if I'm a contending team, I want to shoot for that top 15 overall upside, even understanding the downside there that within a year, if Devontae Adams is the wide receiver 21 in points per game, Mike Evans is the wide receiver 23 in points per game, their market value could be a third of what it is right now. Like, that's the risk that you're having. But if you're selecting within this tier of wide receivers, I want to potentially get the most point equity that I can.
Yeah, I guess it would depend, like I said, with DJ Moore, what number wide receiver is he on my contending team? Like, if I need a wide receiver 3, I think I would rather have Metcalf. But if I need a wide receiver 5, because I've already drafted 4 great wide receivers in my startup so far, I'll take Adams and Evans at that point, because then I might be getting like wide receiver 1 projectable redraft production. So again, you have to think about the redraft projection with these dynasty guys, because all of these guys from like a dynasty ranking standpoint are between like our dynasty wide receiver like 25, 26 with Metcalf, and then more so towards that like mid 30s range with Adams and Evans. They're guys that you want to ideally get in like round 6, round 7, round 8 of your startup after you've already drafted, say, a bunch of wide receivers or a couple stud quarterbacks, maybe a stud running back or a tight end.
And for what it's worth, I do have Metcalf slightly ahead. Sorry. So Metcalf is a top 20 ranked wide receiver for me. So I actually would take him first above this group in terms of dynasty startup rankings. But in terms of the rest of them, like Deebo Samuel's 34, Devontae Adams 31, and who's the other one? Mike Evans, right around that range as well. I believe he's my wide receiver 33. So like you're talking about a very even group at this current point.
Yeah, so you actually have Metcalf a little closer to DJ Moore and Pittman than I do. I have him a little bit lower because higher. I think I'm a little bit more hesitant because of the Geno situation. I've been notoriously lower on Geno, and also too, I think JSN and him are pretty interchangeable in terms of what you're what you're getting on the market as of now. Because JSN, if he has, if he outproduces Metcalf, he's just going to completely
100%.
alpha him, in my opinion. It's going to really impact DK Metcalf's overall market value. And then closing out this tier, or this veteran wide receivers area, we have Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and then Deontay Johnson was the next name that came up. But honestly, there's probably a tier break after Cooper Kupp, because Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin, DeAndre Hopkins, Chris Godwin, those type of guys, they're all kind of interchangeable there.
Hollywood
to
Brown.
me, I just have Deontay Johnson the highest of that group, because he is still only 27 years old, a part of a younger offense than Terry McLaurin. I believe more in Bryce Young as a passer than I do of like Jaden Daniels, for example. So that's why I kind of have Deontay the highest of that group. But the meat and potatoes of this tier is Christian Kirk. To be honest, I feel like is one of the more underrated best ball projections this year, where you should be getting pretty good production. Brian Thomas Jr. is a raw rookie, in my opinion. Christian Kirk, I have wide receiver 23 in my best ball rankings right now, and he's still 27 years old. He still has a couple good PPR seasons in him. Calvin Ridley got the massive bag from Tennessee, but he is 29 years old, hasn't really been productive the last couple of years. He's been off football, had a bit of a disappointing season last year, but was still a top 24 guy. And then Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, and Cooper Kupp, it's like, if you told me one of these guys hit big and two of them were massive busts from a redraft perspective, I would probably believe you. A Cooper has been pretty good in recent years. Cooper Kupp been injured in recent years, but still probably productive if he's healthy. And then Stephon Diggs, we saw take a little bit of a step back with the Buffalo Bills last year, and now he has to compete for targets with Nico Collins and Tank Dell. But I want pieces of that offense. So it's kind of really what you value in this area of the draft: Cooper, Diggs, and Kupp. Do you have like a specific, like, oh, I want this guy over that guy in that range, or is it just like throw him in a hat?
So currently how I have it ranked is I have Stephon Diggs is the number one of this group, like you said, with the projectable offense. Christian Kirk right after him. They're, honest to God, when you're talking about Diggs 37, Kirk 38, Calvin Ridley 39, Cooper Kupp 40, Amari Cooper 41 is how I currently have it. Deontay Johnson, like you said, being a little bit after those guys. So it's funny that those first five names in particular, I literally have back to back to back to back to back.
Yeah, I actually have Kirk the highest of that group from a redraft and a dynasty perspective, because he's the youngest from a dynasty perspective, and I actually have him rated the highest in redraft as well. Because
where do you have him in best ball?
Yeah, in best ball, like he's a great option, I think, because he's going to get 140, 150 targets. I have him 23 in best ball.
Okay, so I have him a little bit lower. I have him at 29, but at the same time, like you said, like I have Diggs at 24, Debo at 25, Zay at 26, Rome 27, Pittman 28, Kirk 29. Like I think you could argue him being ahead of maybe Flowers, Odunze, and Pittman. It's just I have a tough time given the projectable offenses of the Niners, of Houston, of Cincinnati, of Cooper Kupp, if he's healthy, his role with the Rams, that I just can't put him above that group.
This might be an outrageous take, but I would rather have Christian Kirk and redraft than Stephon Diggs, to be honest. I would rather have
I don't think that's outrageous. I mean, there are 5 spots separated in my rankings. Like, I don't think it's outrageous.
Yeah, for sure. And again, this group, it's all kind of what you want. I actually have Amari Cooper ahead of both Cooper Kupp and Stephon Diggs from a redraft perspective as well, because I think he's a clear number one on his team. And he's actually played really well the last 2 years too.
Yeah, I have him wide receiver 21. So like I mentioned there, Kupp was 22, Higgins 23, Diggs 24, Debo 25. Cooper I actually have a 21 because like you said, if he's going to be the same number one wide receiver for this Browns offense, he would already be a solid value as a wide receiver too. If Deshaun Watson gets back to any type of close play that we saw in spurts before he got hurt last year, because obviously the start of the year he didn't start too well, gets hurt, we forget what he was able to do, but there was like a 5-game stretch there where the Cleveland offense was performing at the best pace that it was across the entire season, and Deshaun Watson looked pretty good.
Yeah, and if Chubb is back healthy, that's going to help the offense. Watson played like Joe Flacco last year. Amari Cooper is going to look too low at 21, to be honest. Like, that's a tough thing with Cooper is, like, I feel like he could really Amari Cooper us, where, like, we buy into him and he completely, like, disappears off the face of the earth next year. But again, like, there is upside that he actually finishes better than what he's done so far in his 2 years in Cleveland. And he's been very good, and he's returned on investment. And from a dynasty perspective, man, like, you get this guy as like your 9th pick in a startup. Like, he is not an early round startup pick at all in Amari Cooper. You're getting him as like your wide receiver 6, wide receiver 5. If you play in a 3 wide receiver, 2 flex league, he's like the perfect guy to fill out that last flex spot for you, because he's going to give you great production as a guy who's finished wide receiver 17 in back-to-back seasons and points per game.
It's so funny to me when it comes with Amari Cooper because it's almost kind of been like a 180 from where he was at a few years ago, where he was like the injury prone receiver in Dallas, would always miss time, like it always like ankle issues. Like I think he had
Plantar fasciitis every
plantar
year.
fasciitis every year, like was always on and off the field, very inconsistent. Then he goes to Cleveland. It's like almost the inverse where nobody's giving him credit for he's been a tangibly better receiver in Cleveland than he was in Dallas.
Yeah, it's weird. He was one of the more overrated receivers in the league for a while, and now he kind of became one of the more underrated receivers in the league, which is a really weird, stark 180, like you said. So, again, that's kind of this area of these veteran wide receivers. When we look at what it all looks like when you put them together, this is our top 36 dynasty overall wide receivers. Again, this
Some
includes
micro
both
differences.
the cornerstone wide receivers as well as the veteran wide receivers and kind of how they interact. We've already talked about these guys individually, so let's kind of just like pick apart where they are in terms of their overall tier breaks. We've already kind of talked about this pre-show. Obviously, nothing changes with the top three guys to the top three guys. No. This second tier, the only real difference you and I have is that you don't have AJ Brown in this tier. You have him more so with the London Olave kind of area.
I have AJ Brown a little bit lower in terms of the redraft projections of the veteran receivers in this range. Puka, Garrett Wilson, Amon St. Brown. He's slightly after those guys. With AJ Brown, I have a little bit of concerns about the overall passing volume. And on top of that, he is also the oldest of this group, already at 27 years old. So for me personally, I view him, London, Olave, and Adunze kind of in their, I mean, I think you can throw Tyreek in there as well. They're kind of in their own semi-segment on their own, in my opinion, where Puka would tail off the mid to late first for me. AJ Brown, London, Olave, Adunze, and maybe Tyreek Hill would be that next area. And then after that, it would be kind of like Ayuk, Waddle, Smith, and I would also have Collins in that area.
Yeah, I think my only counter argument, because I don't disagree that AJ Brown you could maybe put in a mini tier just given that he's 27 versus Nakua and all those guys are like 22, 23 years old. The only thing I would counter to that is like AJ Brown was like legitimately the most unstoppable wide receiver for about 10, 11 games to start the season last year. Sure. And once him and Hurts were both kind of dealing with stuff towards the end of the year, it became like where AJ Brown kind of left a sour taste in your mouth. And I think that's the reason that we're downgrading him, because there was a point in time where you could have made the argument he was as valuable as some of the veteran wide receivers like Tyreek Hill from a redraft standpoint. CeeDee Lamb's season was just as good as AJ Brown's to that point in the season, but obviously CeeDee Lamb carried that momentum into the fantasy playoffs and performed a lot better down the stretch. So for me with AJ Brown, it's like we always kind of like do this with AJ Brown where we're like kind of doubting him at the beginning of every season. And then once we see him play football, we're like, oh yeah, this guy's fucking awesome. And he belongs to be like a mid to back end wide receiver one projection year in and year out until he proves me otherwise. That's kind of where I'm at with AJ Brown, which is why I still value him this high.
I just think in terms of the projectable ceiling for the guys in this area with Chase, Lamb, Jefferson, they're a lot more consistent from a 20-plus PPR point per game standpoint. And even Amon St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, if Aaron Rodgers is healthy, Puka Nacua, what he showed in his rookie season. I feel like they're safer bets. Like with AJ Brown at this point, like we talk about the ceiling for him in stretches, it feels like every single year. But until he puts forth a 20-plus PPR point per game season, like I can't put him in that group for me personally. And on top of that, if he doesn't hit 20 points per game this year, he's going to be a 28-year-old wide receiver that is probably on the cusp of dropping another tier.
Maybe, but I just look at a guy who's been 17 points per game last year, wide receiver 8, 17.6 the year before, wide receiver 8, 17.7 2 years before that, wide receiver 6. Like, again, does he have 20 point per game upside? Probably not, unless Smith were to get injured. But to me, I look at such an easy elite projection for a perfect wide receiver 2 for a contending roster. That's why I love if you have like a Chase, AJ Brown wide receiver core. It's just like you feel really good about both of those guys putting forth very difference-making wide receiver production.
The difference is that the other guys in that tier and the tier above, I'd be comfortable having as my wide receiver 1.
Yeah, that's fair. I just think that with Wilson and Nacua and like there's more risk involved with their production. It's like Nacua already had an awesome season or whatever, but it's possible that he never has a season like that again. With Garrett Wilson, he hasn't even sniffed that type of production, even though we're projecting it. So that's why I think AJ Brown belongs in that range. I mean, we can move down to this next tier of like what we view. Like, I don't think there's anything really to gripe about here. Only when we did the cornerstone stuff, we had Waddle and Smith more so in this next tier. It's just for visual purposes. That's kind of why we have it this way. Whereas like London, Olave, Romo Dunze, Tyreek Hill, Brandon Ayuk is kind of like a tier. And like you said, you could throw AJ into that tier as well. Whereas Waddle and Smith are more so in the next tier below.
100%. And if we were to visualize this, obviously we had to do it for the video perspective, but for you guys to kind of get a proper grasp here, Nico Collins, in our opinion, would be Waddle Smith area, and the Brian Thomas, Lab McConkey would be tiered up like we had in the Cornerstone. It's just for visual purposes. Would look pretty janky if we try to fit two more wide receivers in that one mid to late first tier, and Nico Collins wouldn't fit beside Smith given the layout. So that's a big thing. Fun fact, by the way, Nico Collins, more points per game last year than AJ Brown.
Yeah, no, I think you could definitely make the argument for Nico Collins over AJ Brown in Dynasty, given the age and given what we've already seen. It's like, are you paying for what he's already done? Because AJ Brown has already had a great career so far.
Sure.
Or are you paying for what he projects forward to be, which is, maybe he's got 2 more 17-point per game seasons up his sleeve or whatever. But then if he doesn't have that type of production, we know with AJ Brown too, there's the risk that he suffers a hamstring injury and stuff. Like he's dealt with like lower body, like hamstring pulls and stuff like that. So yeah, he's a little bit riskier maybe from an injury perspective, but for me, I just feel so safe and comfortable projecting him as one of the best receivers in the league on a offense that I pretty much just trust. So that's why I have him a little bit higher. I mean, again, you kind of already talked about the difference between like where those rookies ended up. So I don't think we really need to talk about anything in that range. As we talked about, the way that like DK Metcalf, George Pickens, and JSN interact with the veteran receivers is just completely dependent on build. Like if you, at that point in the draft, like George Pickens, JSN, DK Metcalf, you're talking about like the 5th, 6th, 7th round of your startup. You already know your direction to some degree. Like if you drafted Jalen Hurts and, I'm trying to think, Garrett Wilson and Dak Prescott with your first 3 picks, and then you drafted like a running back in the 4th round, another wide receiver in round 5, you're probably going to know that it's smart of you to go in the DK Metcalf, George Pickens route as opposed to the JSN route. Like you want the productive wide receiver as opposed to the young wide receiver hasn't proven it yet.
Yeah, well, again, we'll talk about some of these guys later in the tiers as well, especially, I mean, we kind of alluded to the rookies, Lab McConkey, Brian Thomas. I personally have them in that tier with Worthy. That would be the micro difference there. You mentioned trying to compare JSN, Pickens, Metcalf, Pittman. Like the way I kind of contextualize how to think about this chart visually is that Chase, Lamb, and Jefferson are your first round startup picks. That's why they're 3 first rounders. Marvin Harrison Jr., Amon St. Brown, Garrett Wilson more so go in the mid to early portion of your second. Malik Neighbors, Puka Nacua, AJ Brown more so in your mid to late second portion. I personally would have AJ Brown more so as a 3rd rounder, but that would be the micro difference there. And then obviously these next bunch of guys, you're kind of talking about the start of the 3rd round to, I would say, the early 4th round once you get to the Nico, like the Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, Devontae Smith area.
Yeah. And then, like you said, the mid rounds get filled out with your T Higgins to JSN area. Round 5 to round 7 is probably what we're talking about there. And then again, by this point in the draft, you should probably know if you're competing or not. And in that case, round 7, round 8, round 9, you can get Debo, you can get Devontae Adams there, you can get Mike Evans there. If you're building more of a rebuilding team and you're not looking for that kind of productive players at that point in time, Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette, Jaden Reed, those type of guys make a little bit more sense. And as we talked about, you saw them in the Cornerstone and in the Veterans. Some of the guys missed the cut here. Calvin Ridley, Rashee Rice, guys that were just outside this top 36 for us in terms of our overall rankings. But we did talk about them in our Cornerstone and Veteran wide receiver section. So again, let us know how you guys liked this. I thought it was important for us to, because when you're talking about these wide receivers, it's so hard to distinguish. Would I rather have Tyreek Hill or Rome Odunze? It's like it's completely dependent on where your team is at that point in time. So to me, it makes more sense to segment them: Cornerstone wide receiver rankings, Veteran wide receiver rankings, and then overall rankings in terms of unique situations that you'd be going into in a startup. Would you spend a pick on Tyreek? Would you spend a pick on Rome Odunze? For us, the reason we have Odunze ahead is because he allows you to have a little bit more positional flexibility at that point in time, and you can go towards more of a rebuild if you want to, or build out a contending roster if you want to supplement that production later. So again, hopefully you enjoyed this, the way we broke this down. We'll definitely do this for running backs if you guys want that as well. We'll, do just young running backs, just veteran running backs. If you guys want that, let us know down below in the comments. And also check out all of our dynasty rankings, all of our wide receiver, quarterback, running back, tight end rankings. Just saw a major update. We'll update the trade value chart as well. So you guys know, as you see on the left side of these tiers, what to trade these guys away for, what they're worth on the open market. Ideally, if you're selling them, you get a little bit more than this. If you're buying them, you buy them for a little bit less than what we have them listed as worth here on the open market. So that'll be linked down below in the description, flockfantasy.com, promo code FSE for 7 days for free, 30% off any of the packages, 6 months for free when you sign up annually. Trade value charts, dynasty rankings, dynasty trade calculator, team reviews now live as well. When you sign up for an annual Mother Flocker, you get a free team review for us. So definitely check out all that stuff if you're interested. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.